Taylor from the magazine and website American Renaissance. Jared, welcome to Be Reasonable.
Thank you. Thanks for this invitation.
So some of my listeners may not be familiar with American Renaissance, so would you mind, first of all, I guess, explaining and introducing what the American Renaissance project is and what you're looking to achieve with it?
The project began as a print-based magazine in 1990, so it goes back a long ways. But about 8 years ago, we shifted all of our content to the Internet. The purpose of American Renaissance is to promote what we call race realism and white advocacy. Race realism is the recognition that, unlike fashionable views, race is a genuine biological phenomenon, and it is an important part of individual and group identity. It's also a recognition of the fact that the races, although they have a lot of overlap in their abilities and propensities, races are not interchangeable. In other words, different races pretty consistently build different kinds of societies where you find them. White advocacy is the recognition that whites, just like every other racial group, either in the United States or around the world, have legitimate interests that should be defended. And so those are our two purposes, namely to educate the public on the legitimacy of white interests and for whites to defend them, and also the underlying science and historical record of race realism.
You mentioned white interests there, and I've seen some of your other materials saying that white people have interests that are in common and must be defended. What would you say those interests are? What constitutes white interests?
The most obvious is not to be replaced or reduced to a minority by people of different races. This process has been going on for some time in the United States. You probably are aware that at the time of the last major change in American immigration policy, whites were about 90% of the country, of the population, and since then we have been dwindling rapidly. We're now at about 62% of the population, and by about 2042 or 2045, there are various estimates, we will become a minority. And I feel confident in telling you that in 1965, when the Congress was being told this change in policy is really something of a cosmetic gesture, that it will not change the racial mix of the country, if at that time they had known that in 70 years whites would be reduced to a minority, they would never have passed such a bill. The same process is going on now in Europe as well. There is hardly a country in Europe, except for certain rather steadfast countries in Eastern Europe, where the population is not shifting quite dramatically. And the projections vary, but perhaps by the year 2100, Britain or France or Germany, Italy, some of these countries are projected to be also minority white. Now, if we were to be observing phenomena that were going to reduce Mexicans, for example, to a minority in their country, a minority that would be not just racial, but linguistic, religious, cultural, etc., we would recognize this as cultural imperialism, especially if whites were the people who were coming across the border and changing the nature of their country and reducing them to a minority. White people tend to recognize the importance of cultural and racial homogeneity and coherence when it is non-white groups that are being replaced. There's a certain amount of sympathy, for example, for the Tibetans, who are being replaced in a rather substantial way by Han Chinese. Also the fact of the Uyghurs in the Muslim populations in China. When there is a process of cultural disintegration of which non-whites are the victims, then white people understand this and sympathize. But when whites themselves are being replaced by others, then to resist is called white supremacy, racism, Nazism. I think this is an ultimately suicidal double standard, and we're doing everything possible to counteract that double standard.
So it's interesting that you bring up the plight of Muslim people in China, and as you put it, the sort of disintegration of that community, that culture, because that isn't particularly analogous to the white American experience and the change in shifting demographics of America, because presumably China was never a majority Muslim country that is now becoming non-Muslim as a result of cultural and and community changes, and that's going to be obviously very different to America, which is still a white majority country, and even if that is to change, it's not a minority culture that's being eradicated, but a majority culture that is losing some of its dominance and sort of complete cultural control. So do you think that's a fair analogy to say this minority group in a country where they are overwhelmingly outnumbered, under threat from cultural erosion, is a useful analogy to white America and whatever shifting demographics might have been happening over the last 50 years and may happen in the next 50 years?
Yes, it's a very useful analogy. What's happening in the United States and Europe.
I recognize it's a useful analogy, but I'm saying, do you think it's a fair analogy, a legitimate analogy?
Let me explain why. What's happening in the West, in white countries, is even more astonishing. Well, these white countries, majority countries, are voluntarily undergoing what the Uyghurs in Western China are forced to submit to. The Uyghurs and other minorities in China are being displaced by an aggressive force over which they have very little control. And we sympathize with the fact that they are being displaced and replaced. In the case of Europe, in the case of France, in the case of Italy, in the case of the United States, Australia, this process is instigated by the majority group. And I would say that it is without precedent in the history of the world that a majority that has the power to resist displacement has set aside the exercise of that power and is voluntarily submitting to the kind of change that we find so distressing when non-white groups are forced to submit to it. In that respect, yes, I think it's a perfectly legitimate analogy.
But I think the other side of that is to say that you mentioned that in Britain, as one of the examples you brought up, the cultural shift is changing, and there's an influx of people who are from people of colour from around the world. But as someone who lives in Britain and is aware of that kind of the cultural mix in Britain, it certainly doesn't seem like there is a particular change, an overwhelming change in the culture of Britain. Away from a white majority, and you brought up the idea that in 2100 Britain will be white people in Britain will be in a minority. I'm not sure where those stats are from, but we haven't seen a particularly huge cultural shift or demographic shift in Britain. So for a lot of people, this will just be scaremongering in a way to preserve the dominance of one race in a British culture and arguably an American culture.
What has been happening with the Muslim grooming gangs in places like Bradford is a remarkable and very significant change from traditional British culture. When you have people from a different religion, a different ethnic group, who are taking advantage of young white girls in the most exploitative way. This is a very dramatic example of how Britain has changed. Furthermore, the kind of riots you had several years ago in London, there were whites who participated in them, but riots of that kind that have not been traditionally part of the British landscape. That is a new phenomenon that is due directly to immigration. So these things have, well, yes, these things are unmistakably phenomena that can be laid at the feet of immigration and the changing population of Britain. Now, these things happen step by step, little by little, but it is no coincidence that when parts of London have become majority black or majority Hispanic, white people tend to move out. Why is that? Is that because they're hateful, they're prejudiced? No, it's because they're more comfortable living around people with whom they share a cultural, religious, or aesthetic sense. This is absolutely normal. And why, I would ask you, why is it wrong for British people, white British people, to wish to remain a majority? We take that for granted in the case of the Japanese, for example, the Nigerians, or the Turks.
We'll get to the comfort a little later, but before we go in too much in that direction, I do want to just come back to those two examples that you brought up.
All right.
So, the riots in London, you say is a new phenomenon due to immigration, but how do you square that view with, for example, the Toxteth riots of the 1980s in Liverpool?
Tell me about them.
This was systemic.
Were these football hooligans or something? Or?
No, this was the black population in Liverpool who had long since been living in some of the more rundown and underserved areas of the city during the 1980s, when a government systematically turned its back on supporting Liverpool and putting money into Liverpool, and this spilled out into an expression of frustration, and that turned into a riot. But for you to say that the riots are a new phenomenon due to immigration, it's not a new phenomenon if it was happening 30 years ago.
Well, it is due to immigration. That's precisely my point. You've supplied me with yet another excellent example of what British people can legitimately not want to look forward to. Like the Brixton riots. I think, when were they? In the 1960s? Yes, it goes back several decades, but it's something due to the replacement of populations, the arrival of people who do not fit in, and in many cases do not want to fit in. This is something that we would never have seen if Britain had remained homogeneously white, European, and Christian. And I don't see how you can possibly deny that.
Well, how do you then square that with, for example, the Peterloo massacre in Manchester, which again was a working class, underserved, undersupported community rising up and then actually being attacked by government forces, and this was a white majority. These were white people who've been attacked. All of these riots, it's very easy to put a racial lens on it, but at the same time we could look at this through a class lens and say these were riots of working class people rising up to demonstrate against the fact that they haven't been supported by the government. So this seems like putting a racial lens on it is serving a purpose but isn't sticking to the facts.
The idea that people are justified in rising up violently because the government has not somehow served them or coddled them or made life better for them. The United Kingdom is a country in which there are first world public services. There's public education. And for a neighborhood to say, well, we have gotten the short end of the stick. We certainly haven't gotten what we deserve. And then to rise up violently. I don't think I do not consider that a legitimate reaction. I don't know the details of this white riot that you describe. Obviously, in the time in British history, there have been times when white people have risen up violently and misbehaved. My point is, when you find this phenomenon repeated on the basis of immigrant identification and the fact of being aliens in a country, this is something that could clearly have been eliminated. It clearly have been avoided had there not been this, the Empire Windrush, which first showed up in 1958, I believe it was, bringing a group of West Indian blacks to England. This began a process that Enoch Powell legitimately decried as Britain laying up its own funeral pile. There's absolutely no reason for the country to have done that. The benefits for this are minuscule, and the potential costs are enormous.
Well, it's fascinating that you say the benefits are minuscule just after you were saying that Britain is a first world country with first world services, including a healthcare system. And actually the Windrush generation, large parts of the first people to arrive in the UK were people who'd work in the NHS and go on to be supplying those first class services when we were looking for more people to actually be nurses and healthcare workers. But
tell me this. Do you think the NHS would have foundered? Do you think the NHS would have qualitatively deteriorated without those people? Did those people were they necessary for the NHS to maintain its standards? Of course not.
Well, I think you're absolutely wrong, and on that point, I think you aren't familiar with the facts. I mean, even if we look at the NHS right now, as it's going through a real crisis, one of the biggest crises that it's actually facing is a huge staff shortage, and one of the reasons it has a huge staff shortage is because we require more nurses coming into the country per year, but then because we haven't got nurses in the country being trained, so we actually have seen a 95% drop off in the number of nurses coming to this country, and as a result we have a fundamental staff shortage and crisis in the NHS. So actually external workers is a huge part of the excellent health service that we have in the UK.
Oh dear, white people simply aren't capable of becoming nurses in the United Kingdom? That's a new one on me.
No one's saying they're not capable of becoming nurses, but we are saying that enough people aren't becoming nurses.
Maybe they're being displaced by people from overseas who are willing to work for lower wages. That's